In the last episode, we began moving this town toward its industrial future. Today, I want to run an experiment to see if local leather production is worth the investment. Right now, hides are mostly sold or left unused, while leather is imported for shoe production. If we can process our own hides, the town could support a much larger shoe industry. But getting there won't be simple. We'll need more workers, more farms to support cattle, and the infrastructure to keep the entire chain running. Before we begin, I should mention that the latest update changed how carts work in the town. In earlier versions, laborers could use a cart if one happened to be available, and there was no clear indication that this was happening. The update introduced an on-screen indicator that shows when cart assignments are not ideal. Because of that change, I added a few cart parking areas and adjusted how work is assigned. Building cart sheds for every worker would be unnecessary, so when the error indicator appears, I simply switch that job back to labor by hand and reserve carts for the tasks that actually benefit from them. The first step in this episode was laying out the dock trading post. As the town grows, trade becomes more important, and the dock will allow us to expand what we can import and export. Up to this point, the trading post has handled most of our needs, but as the settlement moves toward heavier industry, that will begin to change. The dock will allow us to start importing additional food items when needed, while also giving us another route to export materials like lime. When placing a dock, you also need to keep river access in mind. The dock must be positioned so ships can reach it without obstruction, which means you should avoid blocking the river with a bridge. In this case, I decided to place the dock near the entry point of the map. There is a small disadvantage to doing this, because ships can arrive faster than you are able to fill their orders. Because of that, it helps to know what nearby cities typically request and keep some of those goods stocked at the dock ahead of time. One of the items that tends to move regularly is lime, so keeping a supply ready makes it easier to complete trade requests when ships arrive. Because the town will need more thread for shoes and clothing, I decided to expand farm production. To support that, I added another bridge to make access to the area easier. After scouting the land, I chose to place the new farm on the opposite side of the river from main town. This gives us plenty of open space to work with and keeps the farmland separate from the growing industrial area. The plan here is to grow flax for textile production, which will provide thread for clothing and shoes, while also planting barley to add another food source for the settlement. At this point, we begin preparing for leather production. The long-term goal is to build a steady supply of hides that can support tanning and eventually expand shoe production. The first step is to construct a cattle shed and hire workers right away, so they are ready when the animals arrive. We won't be bringing cattle in immediately, however, because the support systems need to be in place first. To prepare for that, I start setting up hay dryers and a water platform so the animals will have feed and water once the herd arrives. I also place the cattle shed close to the new farm. This will allow us to use the fallowed fields later on when we begin expanding leather production and need grazing space for the cattle. The hay dryers are handled by the town's laborers. They gather the cut hay from the fields and stack it onto the dryers so it can properly dry. Once the hay has finished drying, the laborers return to collect it and move it into the hay barracks for storage. This keeps a steady supply of feed available for the livestock once the cattle operation begins. To begin producing hides, we also need to build a slaughterhouse. When a cow is processed, it provides several useful resources including meat, tallow, and about 100 hides. Hides spoil fairly quickly, so it is important to have the tannery prepared before slaughtering cattle. All of the required materials should already be in place, so the hides can be processed immediately. Each tanning batch requires 500 hides to cure into leather, which means about 5 cows are needed to start a single batch. Planning ahead and timing the slaughter properly helps prevent valuable hides from being wasted. The tannery is placed close to the slaughterhouse, so hides can be moved into production as quickly as possible. A single tannery can process up to 3 batches at once, for a total of 1,500 hides. For this test, I am only running one batch of 500 hides, so I can study the real cost in labor and materials. The materials needed for tanning are bark, lime, and salt, and those costs are very small. The largest expense would come from buying cattle directly and slaughtering them for hides. If that were the plan, it would actually be cheaper to buy the hides instead. The cattle shed holds 20 animals. Since calves are born each year, it makes more sense to keep the herd number lower and slaughter about 5 cattle per batch as needed. In the long run, that means one tannery will likely need support from several cattle sheds to keep production steady. Because one batch of hides takes 6 months to process, leather production has to be planned carefully. The real challenge is not just making leather, but making enough of it consistently to support both shoe production and market demand. As the town continues to expand and more housing is added, the distance from the original granary eventually becomes too far for efficient access. When that happens, it is important to add another granary so residents can still easily reach food, firewood, and other basic goods. To support the new housing area, I am placing an additional granary here so the town can continue expanding outward. This helps keep supplies distributed across the settlement and prevents long travel times for workers and residents. Later on, I will likely add a warehouse nearby to store items such as firewood, clothes, warm clothes, and shoes. For now, however, laborers can handle moving those goods where they are needed. Originally, I planned to build a salt mine to support the tannery, but for this test, I decided to simply buy salt from the market instead. At this point, I am not yet sure whether producing hides locally would actually be profitable. Right now, the operation includes 4 workers at the tannery, several workers managing the cattle shed, and 1 worker at the slaughterhouse. On the market, hides sell for about 0.25 each, while shoes sell for roughly 0.32. A salt mine would require 2 full-time workers once it begins operating. With wages set at about $1.00 per year per worker, a single tanning batch of 500 hides takes 6 months to complete. Shoe production itself is relatively inexpensive to run, costing about $1.00 per year in labor, and the throughput can range between 500 and 1,000 shoes per month. At larger scale, producing around 1,000 shoes per month could bring in roughly $320 in revenue. On paper, the numbers look promising, but this test will help determine whether the system actually performs that well in practice. For this test, I purchased the cattle needed to begin production, but I quickly discovered that I was not as prepared as I thought. I had just barely enough hay to support the animals, which meant the operation started under a bit of pressure. I also realized that I had forgotten to purchase the salt needed for the tanning process. Because of that mistake, I ended up slaughtering a few cattle earlier than planned just to keep things moving. The lesson here is an important one. Before starting the process, it is best to make sure everything is ready in advance. Always have the required materials and supplies prepared before beginning production so valuable resources are not wasted. Another detail to pay attention to is which trader you are actually selling to. In this case, I made a sale through the trading dock, but had placed the goods in the trading post. Because the order was tied to the dock while the items were stored at the post, the transaction did not complete the way I expected. As a result, I did not earn anything from that particular order. It is a small detail, but an important one. When setting up trade orders, always make sure the goods are stored at the same location where the trader will collect them. A large portion of the time spent during this recording was devoted to routine town management that has already been covered in earlier episodes. As the settlement grows, there are always small tasks that need attention: adjusting production, moving workers, and keeping supplies balanced. While these steps are important for keeping the town running smoothly, they are not new systems, so I have shortened those sections here and focused mainly on the parts related to leather production. After reviewing the numbers more carefully, the cost of buying salt on the market is about 10 cents per unit. At that price, Using purchased salt for tanning would actually reduce the profit from leather production. Based on the calculations, buying salt would result in a loss of roughly 3 cents per unit in the production chain. Because of that, importing salt for large-scale tanning does not make economic sense. For the leather industry to remain profitable, it will be better to produce our own salt locally rather than rely on the market. Now that all of the required materials are in place, we can begin the leather production process. To start the first batch, 5 cattle are slaughtered to provide the 500 hides needed for tanning. With the hides prepared and the tannery supplied with bark, lime, salt, and water, the curing process can begin. From this point, it will take about 6 months for the hides to finish processing and become usable leather. Keep in mind that the cost threshold to beat is 7 cents per hide. Anything above 7 cents for each hide processed would create a loss in the leather chain. In this test, I bought salt at 10 cents per unit, and one batch of 500 hides requires 150 units of salt. At that price, buying salt makes the batch unprofitable. However, if I mine the salt myself, the cost drops to less than 1 cent per unit, while the market value remains around 10 cents. On paper, that would make local salt production far more profitable for the tannery, as long as spoilage and supply delays do not eat into the margin. With the first batch underway, we can finally look at the numbers and see whether this leather production chain actually makes economic sense. For this batch, we are processing 500 hides. Across the entire process, there are 8 workers involved between the cattle shed, slaughterhouse, and tannery. Wages are set at $1 per worker per year, so over a 6-month production cycle that places the labor cost for this batch at about $4. The next important material is salt. Each batch requires 150 units of salt to cure the 500 hides. If the salt is purchased from a market at 10 cents per unit, that would cost about $15 for the batch. At that price, the leather chain becomes unprofitable because the cost per hide rises well above the break-even point. The number we need to stay under is 7 cents per hide. Anything above that begins to erase the profit from selling shoes later in the chain. However, if the town mines its own salt, the cost drops dramatically. Mining salt brings the cost to under 1 cent per unit. At that rate, the 150 salt required for this batch costs roughly $1.50 or less. When we combine that with the labor cost of about $4, the total cost for the batch comes to approximately $5.50. Dividing that across 500 hides gives a production cost of roughly $0.011 per hide, which is well below the 7 cents break-even threshold. Based on those numbers, producing leather locally is significantly cheaper than purchasing it from the market. There are also additional benefits that are not fully included in this calculation. The cattle produce milk for the town, beef that can be sold or consumed locally, and tallow that can be processed later. These byproducts help offset the overall cost of maintaining the herd. So on paper, the numbers strongly favor local production. The main risk to watch for will be spoilage and keeping the supply chain moving efficiently. As long as the tannery is prepared and materials are ready before slaughtering cattle, the leather industry should remain profitable as production scales up. At this point in the town's development, it is a good time to step back and look at how far things have come. What began as a small settlement is now developing into a stable industrial town with several production chains working together. Right now, the industry is running at a very good pace. We have 3 mines supplying raw materials, supported by 3 smelters that keep metal production moving. Lime production is active with a lime works and kiln, which supports construction and other industries across the town. Manufacturing is also expanding. The town is producing shoes, textiles, and oil, while 3 farms provide food and agricultural goods that support both the population and the livestock economy. The blacksmith is producing metal parts that are exported to neighboring towns, and our charcoal exports continue to perform very well in the market. One of the strengths of this economy is that most raw materials are not simply sold in their basic form. Instead, they are processed into higher value goods before export. Ore becomes metal parts, wood becomes charcoal, hides become leather and shoes, and agricultural goods support the industries that drive the town's growth. Financially, the town is in a strong position. The treasury has grown to over 11,000 coins, and this has been achieved without taking a single loan. Growth has been steady and sustainable, funded entirely through production and trade. By building each industry step by step and making sure the numbers work before expanding further, the town has developed a stable foundation. From here, the focus will be on continuing to scale production, improving efficiency, and supporting new industries like leather that can build on the systems already in place. That brings the New Haven series to a close. What began as a small settlement has grown into a stable and profitable industrial town, built step by step through careful planning and experimentation. Along the way, we explored how the town's economy works, testing industries, working through the numbers, and building supply chains that keep everything running smoothly. From early survival to a thriving settlement with strong exports and a healthy treasury, New Haven has proven that a well-planned town can grow into something very successful. If you made it this far into the series, then this content is meant for you. If you enjoyed the deeper look into how the systems work and the process of building the town from the ground up, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. In the next series, we'll be starting a brand new settlement on a different map and exploring a completely different approach to building town. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next town.